Hello everyone and welcome back to the School of Taste. I am Nick Jackson. Very pleased to be back with you for our final session in Wine Tasting by Structure, our webinar examining different varieties for acid structure and for tannin structure. In this final session, we get to look at three quite different, but I think very, very interesting varieties in terms of tannin structure. So I've been looking forward to this one. As usual, if you are watching live, please use the questions function to submit your comments and questions. And if you are watching on recording, thank you very much for taking the time to do that. Okay, so without further ado, why don't we move on with today's session. So this slide will, of course, be familiar to all of you now. It's just a reminder of what we're going to look out for in terms of tannin structure when we're thinking about these different red varieties. Sometimes just using one of these categories, the level or the type or the location of tannin, can give us an idea about what variety we might be working with. But more usually, you need two or sometimes all three really to hone down your options and to say it must be this variety. Because once again, as I always say at the top, my argument, both in these webinars and in my book, Beyond Flavor, is simply that every major red and white variety has got a slightly different structure. And if you know how to understand and how to taste for that structure, then you're going to be able to narrow down your options of what that variety you're tasting might be. So irrespective of winemaking or climate or anything else, the tannin structure in the red wines we're going to taste today should remain pretty consistent. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to start today's session, excuse me, with the Grenache variety, Grenache in France or elsewhere, or Garnacha in Spain, of course. So why don't you guys, first of all, as you're pouring your wines, tell me what aromas and flavors you're getting. And after we've done aromas and flavors, we'll move on to the structure part of it. And then please also tell me from which region your wine comes, because that's going to be very relevant in understanding exactly the profile of the wine that you have. Okay, so I'll let you guys have a second to do that. Now, we know that Grenache is a variety that is quite often blended. Some of you may have been able to find single monovarietal expressions of Grenache, perhaps from places like the Syrah de Gredos in Spain, or perhaps from Catalonia, or maybe from southern France. But even in most of those places, usually you get a bit of blending. Usually a bit of Syrah, perhaps Mourvedre, other varieties in there as well. So we can talk about that a bit later, about why varieties like Grenache are quite often blended. Let's just see what you guys are saying, first of all. Okay, here we go. Fleur from the Roussillon in the south of France. Strawberry compote, white pepper and sweet spices with a chalky, dry character. Quite interesting contrast between the ripeness of the red fruits that you're talking about, Fleur, and the chalky, dry character. So perhaps not exactly what you'd expect, but I think nonetheless quite typical of many French reds. Louise is in Priorat in Spain, mature, blackberry and dark plums. So darker fruits by the sounds of it than Roussillon. Cigar box and a hint of green. Okay, good. Lynn has got a Côte du Rhône Village, which is 80% Grenache. Medium ruby with a lovely wild strawberry, cherry, red plum and a bit of leather. Good. I like the comment, by the way, about the color of the wine in the glass. I do think that Grenache can have one of the best, most perfect examples of a ruby color if it's not too heavily blended. But it is a variety, I think, that even if you add even a little bit of Syrah or Mourvedre or these other thicker skinned varieties, you can increase the intensity of that color quite quickly. But I do love those very ruby examples of Grenache. Maria, Chateauneuf du Pape, very ripe black and red fruits, good. Excellent. So some nice comments there. And to keep them coming, but while you're doing those, also, why don't we start thinking a little bit about tannins now? Of course, I know that some of you have got some other varieties blended in there, but for the sake of this session, let's just pretend that we're just working with Grenache. We'll talk about blending in a little bit. But first of all, tell me about the level of tannin in your Grenache example. Corey is in Chile. You don't see that very often, do you? A Grenache or Garnacho from Chile, but Corey's saying a red plum with a slightly green finish. Sometimes you do get a green character, a herbaceous herbal character from some wines in Chile across all varieties. I think that Grenache is probably not a variety which very often lends itself to being kind of herbaceous and green, but even that variety in Chile perhaps can take on some of those notes. Alberto is commenting that his example has got moderate tannins and they're a bit coarse. Okay. Lynn's saying moderate and smooth. Okay. Very good. We'll just try and get down the level of tannin first, and we'll come on to the other ones in just a minute. Again, I do think the level is probably something that changes a little bit according to the climate where the variety is grown, but nonetheless, let's do our best. Louise is saying her example has got moderate tannins, and Maria also medium, Corey moderate. Okay, so it's quite interesting that we're not so far at least getting any high levels of tannin. We've had plenty of varieties in these sessions which have got high levels of tannin, but it seems like Grenache, Garnacha is not one of them. Okay, very good. Now let's think about the type of tannin. What we're really trying to get at with the type of tannin is the texture of those tannins, or the sensation that they leave on the palate. What adjective, what word can you find to best describe that sensation? I put some suggestions on this slide, but of course you are not limited to those. You may come up with more creative and interesting ones than I've done. That would be totally fine. Louise is saying coarse, sort of coarse, grainy. Okay, good. Corey is saying chalky. Very good. Alberto is saying a bit coarse. Good. Lynn is saying smooth. So some people are saying coarse and some people are saying smooth. So maybe a little bit of a contrast in those different wines. Lynn is commenting on that feature. I'm not getting coarse. Lynn says my tannins are sandy to smooth. Okay, very nice. Maria is saying chalky. So we've got a few chalkies, one grainy, and quite an emphasis on smooth. Sometimes I think if you're in the kind of grainy world of texture, chalky, grainy, even powdery, then it can be not such a big step to get to smooth, because depending on the size of that grain, of how grainy that graininess is, sometimes if you have a very fine grain, it can actually get quite close to being smooth. We've talked about that a little bit in previous sessions. Vitaly is saying moderate grainy for Priorat. Okay, good. And then why don't you tell me about the location of these tannins in your mouth? Of course, as with most tannins, we feel them everywhere, but is there a particular place where they seem to be focused most? A particular location, a physical location in your mouth where, especially after you swallow, you feel them more than in other places? I think that this is one of those ones where you really have to listen to the wine after you've spat or swallowed to see what it has to say. The finish will reveal a lot about the location of these tannins in the mouth. Louise is commenting that for her, she feels the tannins on the cheeks and in the gums. Good. Does everyone agree with Louise, cheeks and gums, or is everyone going to go somewhere else? Maria says she feels them on the tongue. Good. Alberto agrees with Louise, cheeks and gums for Alberto. And Vitaly is saying on the back of the palate, so maybe around the back. And then Lynn is saying also cheeks and tongue. Okay, so there does seem to be quite an emphasis on cheeks, which we don't experience cheek tannins very often. So that's something which is a bit different. Okay, so let me see what I came up with for Grenache. Okay, hopefully you guys know where this picture is. The bridge is the clue in this picture. Okay, so level of tannins, you said moderate. I agree with you. In some cheaper, more commercial examples, you can have low levels of tannin in Grenache. If you think about the way that Grenache is used in blends from southern France, from Spain, in, for instance, rosé from Provence or from northern Spain, what's it there for? It's there to supply fruit. A lot of the time, the emphasis on the use of Grenache is in order to not so much about to supply tannin, because other varieties can do that very easily, or to supply color for the same reason, but just to supply juicy fruit. So I don't think it's a sort of downfall or a deficit of Grenache or Garnacha that it doesn't have very high tannins, because usually it's blended with other varieties that do. So low to moderate. Shengli is saying, I have a Garnacha from Sierra de Gredos and another one from Priorat. Okay, so the type of tannin. Now, these are some words which we haven't actually used too much in connection with other varieties. So they just, let me unpack them a little bit. So loose knit, remember our classic example of a tight knit tannin variety is Cabernet Sauvignon. That means that the tannins feel very tightly wound, especially when the wine's young. They're all kind of very kind of woven together very tightly. Whereas loose knit means they're a bit more relaxed. They're not so tight. They're not so wound up. They're just a bit more loose knit. Diffuse gets to the same kind of point. Diffuse means, in this case, they don't have such a focal point where you feel them, and instead they tend to spread out throughout and across all parts of the mouth. So I apologize, I did give you a bit of a trick question when I asked you, where do you feel it in the mouth? Because for me, Grenache Garnacha is one of the very few varieties where, in fact, it's really honestly true that you do feel those tannins everywhere in the mouth. Again, I'll repeat what I always say, which is that in many, probably all varieties, you do feel tannins everywhere in the mouth. But what I always say is that you can detect a focal point in different parts of your mouth for different varieties. But here, I don't think you can. Here, I just think you feel the tannins everywhere. And so when you guys are talking about cheeks and tongue, and if you think about it, you're talking about the center of the mouth and the extremities of the mouth and the cheeks. So that's what you're kind of getting towards, that it really covers all of the mouth. And I agree with that. To me, Garnacha is one of the few wines where you do feel the tannins everywhere. So when I say the word diffuse, diffuse means spread out, right? There's no one point where you feel them most. So they're really coming to the same point, those two descriptions. Sticky tannins. Sticky, I mean that this is a bit of a tricky one because sometimes the quite ripe, sweet tasting red fruits of the Grenache variety does itself taste quite sticky almost. There's almost a kind of candied quality sometimes to the red fruits in Grenache, not in the more powerful or the more savory examples perhaps, but maybe at the lower levels. So the fruit itself can have a bit of a sticky quality, but in addition, the tannins can too. So we've talked about, in the past, we've talked about clay tannins, tannins that feel like clay, that kind of cling to the gums, or grippy tannins. They also cling to the gums, but perhaps a bit more aggressively. Here, my argument for the Grenache tannins is they kind of stick to the gums, and you can't kind of pull them off. You can't really do that because they're very adhesive. They stick to the gums. And then finally, and I think this perhaps also goes to the diffuse spread out point, is they have sometimes Grenache tannins have got a kind of powdery quality. which this is part of the kind of grainy things that some of you guys were saying, or chalky. My word is powdery, which means that if you do find any grain in the texture of Grenache, then it's a very fine grain. So fine, in fact, it almost assumes the quality of powder. Very, very tiny little grains that almost just seem to dust across the palate, just leave a faint imprint of grain on the palate. That's what I mean by powdery. And I guess if you think about it, that also is similar to loose knit, right? They're not quite tightly woven enough together to be more than powdery. Powdery by itself indicates or hints at the sense of them being spread out, almost floating across the palate as if on the wind. So that's what I think about the type of tannin. And then under the other terms, structureless structure. So this is my point about the paradox of Grenache tannins. Structureless structure means that you do feel the tannins, and in the same way that tannins always behave, they do dry out your mouth. Of course they do, they're still tannins. But somehow, in spite of doing that, they don't really seem to provide much structure, much architecture, much shape in the mouth. They're present, but they don't give any sense of architecture. So contrast these tannins with, say, Cabernet tannins, where you feel them very much around the gums. We talked about that horseshoe shape of tannins in Cabernet, a very particular shape they give to the wine with that little hole in the middle of Cabernet. In Grenache, I don't think there is any similar shape. These diffuse tannins are still there. They're still the structural components, but they just don't offer any structure. Again, I said this in my book, and one of the critics said that I was criticizing the variety. I'm not criticizing variety. I really don't mind what type of tannins any variety has. I'm just trying to get at this sense of what the purpose of the tannins are. And I think the purpose or the identity of Grenache tannins might be a little bit different from those of other varieties. Corey just commenting that the tannins in Grenache are fruit wrapped. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, there's so much fruit in Grenache in any case that they do seem to, the fruit does envelop the tannins. But again, because the tannins almost seem to diffuse themselves into the body of the wine, it's hard to know where the tannins begin and the fruit ends, because you just get these little powdery sprinkles of tannin somehow wrapped up there in the fruit. The final term I've written on here is sweet spice. Someone mentioned that nonetheless their wine finished quite dry, maybe on a chalky finish, but this is certainly one of the sweetest tasting varieties which is grown broadly in Europe. If you think about Châteauneuf-du-Pape and the other Southern Rhone examples, some examples from Spain as well, not necessarily Priorat, where there can be quite a lot of blending varieties in there, but there's a lot of quite sweet tasting Grenache out there. But I think what you're still looking for in European examples is that dry finish over and against, to contrast with, say, an example from McLaren Vale in Australia, which is a great source of world-class Grenache, where the finish is still quite sweet tasting in keeping with the rest of the wine. Any other comments about Grenache or Garnacha before we move on? I do want to talk about blending again, because it's such an important facet of Grenache, but I think I will leave it until we talk about Syrah in just a minute, because obviously that's the usual and most common blending variety, at least in France. We always think, when we're thinking about Grenache, about Châteauneuf-du-Pape, Gigondas, Priorat, and other famous celebrated appellations like that. But let's not forget, the vast majority of Grenache in France is used in Côte du Rhône blends, at quite a low price, and it's grown all over northern central Spain, where it can make fruity, juicy inexpensive reds, but also rosados as well. So again, a lot of demand for lower price Grenache to make fruit forward, but nonetheless European style wines in these regions. And sometimes with those very fruity wines, it helps to have something to offset the intensity and the sweetness of that fruit. So that's where perhaps we can talk a little bit about blending when we go on to Syrah. Okay, so the picture, by the way, of course, is Avignon, Avignon, which was home to the popes, just outside Châteauneuf-du-Pape, hence the name Châteauneuf-du-Pape of the Pope. This is the bridge which only spans half of the Rhône River. It stops halfway, sur le pont d'Avignon. Okay, so let's move on to our Syrah example. Let me just see here. Okay, let's put it back to this slide. Now tell me, again, let's start with aromas and flavors for Syrah, Shiraz. If you have an example, perhaps not from Europe, tell me the aromas and flavors you're getting, and tell me which region your wine comes from when you do that. And then after that, we'll think about tannins in Syrah. I did wonder whether, when I was kind of ordering this session, to whether I should put the Shiraz or the Syrah next to the Grenache like I have done, or whether I should put the Tempranillo next to the Grenache to kind of stay in Spain. But I decided in the end that the importance of the Côte du Rhône blends is so big that I'd rather put Grenache and Syrah right next to each other so we could compare them. Okay, anyway, that's just by the by. So tell me what you guys are tasting, what wines you have today for Syrah. Definitely one of my favorite varieties. It's funny enough, at least in this country, in the States, quite a hard sell by the bottle in a restaurant. The domestic examples from the US, perhaps a bit easier if you have an example from the Northern Rhône, but this is the land of Cabernet, where in varietally labeled wines, people know Cabernet better than they know any other red variety apart from Pinot Noir. So it is a little bit tough to find varietal Shiraz, Syrah on wine lists in this country compared to Cab. Okay, so let's see what you guys have got. Louise is in southwest Australia. So do you mean Margaret River, Louise? Is that where you are? Marmalade, sweet plums, sweet spice. Good, sounds delicious. Lynn has got Penfolds RWT. Wow, lucky you, Lynn. That's a great wine from 1999. Wow, how about that? Barossa Valley. Medium garnet color. Yeah, I can well believe that. And how is that holding up at 21 years old, Lynn? Maria has got a Hermitage. Wow, you guys are bringing out the big guns, okay, for the final session. Hermitage, black, ripe fruit. Very good. Alberto in Walla Walla, Washington. One of my favorite places for Shiraz in the New World. Powerful, but very expressive, aromatic style. Blackberry, blueberry, violet, black pepper. Yep, that sounds like Walla Walla, Washington to me. Vitali, also from the Barossa. Very good. Fleur in Hawke's Bay, New Zealand. Good. So cool climate in New Zealand. Licorice, black pepper, black cherry, and herbal notes. Sounds great. What's the winery, Fleur, on Hawke's Bay? I know it can be a little bit difficult to find many examples of New Zealand Syrah. Just interested what the winery is. Corey in the Northern Rhône with deep purple color. I assume you mean violets, black and blue fruit with a flinty, peppery finish. Good note. Sounds great and very classic. Lynn this is the 1999 Barossa leather, plum and black cherry. It shows its age, but it's very remarkably hearty. Sounds delicious, Lynn. I'm very envious of you. Vitali, dark, overripe jam, fruit, coffee, chocolate, licorice. That is Barossa. So ripe fruits and coffee and chocolate notes, licorice, all statements about ripeness there. Fleur's example of Hawke's Bay, New Zealand is Trinity Hill. Commenting good value wine. Shengli is in South Africa. Oh, you guys are taking us on a geographical tour. This is great. These are some of the great producing regions for Syrah all around the world. In the Swartland, South Africa, Reductive, Bretty, Earthy, tart, and just ripe blackberry. Okay, good. So maybe a more restrained example, Shengli from South Africa. Shengli does make a good point by mentioning that the Syrah can be a reductive variety. We have talked a little bit about reduction. Maybe we have in previous sessions, but if not, reduction is that quality usually found in white wines where it's a bit like a struck match or a flinty or slightly smoky quality. Often you get it in Chardonnay, that's the most famous place, sometimes in Burgundy, but sometimes in New World regions for Chardonnay as well. And it's simply wine made with very little presence of oxygen. So the oxygen-free environment does create these slight aromas of smokiness. And now I do think we don't really talk very often about reduction in red wines. It's really seen as more of a white wine thing. But if there is one variety which I think does do reduction in red wines, particularly consistently, it's Syrah. I don't know why, but Syrah to me is often quite reductive, quite smoky on the nose, which can be confusing because Syrah often is a smoky variety in aroma as well. So a bit confusing, but Syrah can be reductive. Yes, I agree, Shengli. Okay, so let's think about the tannins in your examples. Again, this is going to be super interesting because you've got such a wide geographical range of examples. Tell me about the level of tannin in your examples, and maybe you can compare it to the Grenache, the Garnacha that you just had. Whether you have more or less. Maria is saying high, and we certainly didn't have any high tannins for Garnacha. If someone had had a very powerful Priorat, I think that might have had high tannin. Often those wines are quite big, especially the ones going on those steep slopes in Priorat. They can have high tannins, but that would be an exception, I think, in the world of Garnacha. But Syrah, Maria saying hi. Lynn with the old Barossa, quite drying, moderate tannins, medium tannins. Now, as the fruit fades, velvety tannin is boosted by more apparent acidity, very much mid-mouth. Good. Louise is saying quite low in, where were you again, Louise? I can't remember where you were. Quite low tannins, I think medium minus from Australia. Okay, good. So low to moderate for Louise in Australia. Okay, so we've got everything from low to high. And I always feel a bit silly asking this question about the level of tannin, because all of these world famous varieties which are grown in so many different places, the level of tannin depends not only on climate, but especially on what the winemaker wants to do. Anyone can make a wine with more tannins if you extract more heavily. So it is a little bit of a function of the variety, but also a lot of the winemaker. But I do think that the next two categories, type and location of tannin, are things that no winemaker can change. So that's why I like to include them as well, but at least the level of tannin gets us started. Fleur is saying moderate tannins, but more angular from New Zealand. Alberto is saying high tannins, very good. Okay, and then let's think about the type of the tannin, the texture, the sensation of the tannins. What are you going to go with? Are these ones also grainy or powdery, like we were talking about with Grenache, or are we in a different world? What's your go-to here? I think it can be quite hard to find the exact right adjective. I mean, it's hard in English, so if English is not your first language, then it's even more difficult. So I apologize for that, but I think it can be quite helpful if you can have words that at least speak to you. You know what you're referring to. Maria is saying chalky. Louise is saying smooth and silky from Southwest Australia. Good. Lynn is saying velvety, very fine and polished. So velvety, fine and polished sounds to me quite a premium style of wine, that the tannins have been clearly very carefully handled, but they've also seen age in Lynn's example. Alberto is saying smooth and polished. So quite a lot of emphasis here. We've had silky, we've had velvety, we've had smooth, we've had polished, and we've also had chalky as well. So much more of an emphasis here on these terms which connote a soft texture or a fine texture. So that's quite interesting. Vitali also saying high levels, but polished tannins as well, same as Alberto. Okay, good. And then finally, is there one location in your mouth where you feel these tannins more than anywhere else? Or are we back with the Grenache where they're kind of just generic and just a bit all over? Is this a structureless structure wine like Grenache, or has this one got a bit more obvious structure, which gives a bit more shape to the wine when it's in your mouth? Louise is saying cheeks. Okay. What does everyone else think? Do you agree with Louise? I think there might be another example, by the way, just while I'm thinking about it, which offers somewhat structureless structure, if you're interested in this whole topic, which I think is Zinfandel. Zinfandel is not a variety that we see too often, but quite powerful tannins actually in Zinfandel, much more than in a typical Grenache. But often they don't seem to provide much obvious or at least easily discernible structure to the wine. You know they're there because you feel your mouth drying out, but there's no obvious shape that they give. They're just sort of there. So I would also, if you ever want to do that tasting, do a Grenache and a Zinfandel and see what I mean by the structureless structure thing. Vitali is saying that the Syrah is like the Grenache and having them all over. Lynn is saying tongue coating. On the tongue in the middle of the mouth. Fleur is saying on the front of the gums. Shengli is saying tongue and cheek. Okay, good. Alberto is saying mostly felt on the gums. Okay, good. Certainly in these examples where some of you have got high levels of tannin, it can be quite hard to identify exactly where they are, because if you have high tannins in a Syrah, maybe from some of your Australian examples or whoever's got the Hermitage, or, you know, these wines are wines with a lot of tannin in them. And especially when the wines are young, just trying to work through those layers of tannin, it can be hard to find exactly where they're at. So this is a bit of a tough question for those examples. Maria saying tongue and upper gums. Good. Okay, so let me just see. Let's go forward to my slide on Syrah. Here we go. So Syrah in general, I think, has got moderate to high levels of tannin. Of course, there are some examples which have got lower tannins, but generally Syrah is a variety which has got high levels of color and high levels of tannin. One of the deepest colored varieties can even be purple in color when the wine is young, but very opaque wines, very hard to see through, generally Syrah wines. And the levels of tannin, generally moderate to high, depending on your region, but more than Grenache for sure, no doubt about that. Now the type of tannin, so we use powdery in connection with Grenache. So some of you were mentioning chalky, powdery in some examples. Now I think you're more likely to get those ones in European examples from cooler climates. Maybe the New Zealand, whoever had the New Zealand example, maybe you feel that as well. But generally, I think as you get to riper sites within Europe, or if you go to the New World, you get warmer climates and the tannin seems to get a bit riper and become more velvety. Some of you guys are saying smooth, absolutely. Some of you are saying polished, totally. But one thing, so again, I don't see that to me, there's a very straight line from powdery to chalky to velvety, or the other way around, chalky, powdery, velvety. I think that's very consistent. But in any case, the overall point I want to make about the texture of these tannins in Syrah is that, to me, they've got some of the best texture of any tannins of any variety. Whether that very velvety, plushly textured tannins, or the slightly powdery, chalky ones, but nonetheless high quality. The texture is just a wonderful thing in the tannins. I do think that Syrah, the fruit also has got a wonderful texture. Not very often we think about the texture of the fruit, or I guess of the tannins in Syrah, but if you have an Australian example, you might notice how absolutely seamless the fruit is, how there's no hard edges at all. There's nothing coarse or rough about the fruit. It's just so seamless. And so I think that both the tannins and the fruit have got a similar quality in Syrah. Syrah would not be an example for me of a too textured variety. Syrah, I think you've got high quality textured tannins and high quality fruit, both of this velvety, not soft because the tannin is quite powerful, but wonderfully textured, velvety, powdery tannins in Syrah. And then in terms of location, I believe this is the most famous variety, or the most important international variety, which has got tannins on the tongue. And now my illustration here with the knot, that's my idea of tannins in a young Syrah. And what it means is that it feels as if in the middle of your tongue, there is a knot of tannin, like it's all wound up and bound up, just waiting to unfurl. But in the meantime, it sits there like a knot right in the middle of your tongue. And again, you can feel those tannins elsewhere too, but I think the focal point where you feel almost the density or the weight of those tannins most powerfully is on the tongue. And if you think about other powerful full-bodied varieties, Cabernet, Merlot, Nebbiolo, none of these varieties have got tannins on the tongue. And that's what I think makes Syrah such an interesting and distinctive variety, the location of those tannins. So I don't think it's a stupid confusion to confuse, say, Left Bank Bordeaux Cabernet Sauvignon with Syrah from, say, the Northern Rhone. But I think the tannin location is very different. You think about the Cabernet tannins around the gums, and this is exactly where the tannins are not in Cabernet, felt on the tongue. So I think this is where this method can be very, very useful in distinguishing these little differences, but which will help you to identify the variety a bit better. Okay, Shengli is asking, Syrah's high levels of tannins are still generally lower than the high tannins in Cabernet, Nebbiolo, Sangiovese. No, I would definitely say Syrah has got more tannins than Sangiovese. I would say then it gets really into the kind of climate or the style of wine you want to make compared to Nebbiolo and Cabernet Sauvignon. But whoever's got the Walla Walla example, please tell me if you think there are many wines in the world which have got more tannins than the wine you're drinking right now. These are massive, massive wines. Hermitage, Walla Walla, some of the more powerful Australian examples, huge levels of tannin. Now, Syrah is also a variety where you can rein down the tannin quite easily if you have a Côte du Rhône, or you have a simple, a lower priced Shiraz, or Fleur with the New Zealand example. These can have low to moderate levels of tannin. Maybe you can't tone down the levels of tannin in your Nebbiolo as much as you can in Syrah. Fine, I grant you that. But I think that Syrah can have just as powerful tannins as those very tannic varieties at the high end. Because don't forget, you know, we're in the presence here of a variety, Syrah, which can be one of the longest aging of all red wines. You know, perhaps not as long as some of the great Cabernet Sauvignons, but surely as long as many of the great Nebbiolos. You think about the Hermitage, Côte Rôtie, Cornas, these famous appellations in the Northern Rhone. And for that, they just need a concentration of tannins that are going to help the wine age. So Louise is saying, way too seamless and without any edges on the Australian Syrah. Yeah, I think if you're looking to have a bit of bite and dryness and attack in tannins, in wine, then sometimes Australian Shiraz isn't the right place to go, because like I was saying, the velvety, absolutely seamless texture often doesn't really allow for it. You can still get very high levels of tannin in those wines at the higher ends, whoever's got the RWT. But the seamless texture or the nature of them just means that if you really want tannins to chew on, maybe Barossa isn't the place to go. I totally agree, Louise. Vitali's asking a question about sparkling Shiraz. That's quite a niche question, Vitali, but anyone who's enjoyed sparkling Shiraz on Christmas Day, as they do in Australia or anywhere else, will know that nonetheless there are tannins in that wine for sure, a moderate level at most, maybe even low. That's a wine more about fruit and more about color than it is about tannins, but there are still nonetheless tannins. Lynn is saying, I think the fact that the tannins in Syrah are velvety and sort of plush. I agree, plush is a good word. Thank you, Lynn. They don't feel as hard-edged as tannins in the other varieties. It may seem less, but I think it's shape rather than quantity. Yeah, I think that's a great point, Lynn, going back to Shengli's point, that it's really about, because of the difference in texture, we may be lulled into thinking there's less quantity of tannins. But in fact, I think it's just a difference in texture is the point that Lynn is making. They don't feel as hard-edged, Lynn says, as tannins in other varieties. And that's what makes us think perhaps that they're lesser in quantity. But in fact, their plushness and their softness conceals how high they are. So I think that's a point very articulately made and much better than I did. So thank you, Lynn. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about Syrah as a blending variety with Grenache. So in the Côte du Rhône examples, what would Syrah add to a Grenache wine? Why would you add Syrah to a wine? And I ask you to turn your minds back to when we had this conversation about Merlot and Cabernet. And what we remembered from that is that Cabernet can have a slight deficit of fruit, but Merlot can sometimes have an excess of fruit. So what Cabernet lacks, Merlot can make up for. Merlot sometimes cannot have very structured or very dynamic tannins, but that's exactly what Cabernet can offer. Merlot sometimes has rather lower acidity, but Cabernet generally retains its acidity quite well. So you can see for all those reasons, those two varieties are such excellent blending partners. And in the same way, I think there are many things that Syrah can add, even in a small quantity, 10 or 20% can make a difference, because as we've just discussed, Syrah is a pretty powerful variety. Louise is commenting that Syrah would bring fruit and a velvety structure. Yes, so fruit, I think Grenache has probably got quite a lot of fruit already. Take your standard issue Côte du Rhône blend, it's probably going to be 80% Grenache, 20% Syrah, something like that. In that case, I think there's already going to be plenty of fruit, but I totally agree about the structure. So Grenache, as we just talked about, can be a bit structureless, even if it's got tannins. So Syrah will provide a much firmer structure. And also, the other thing I think in terms of fruit, going back to the fruit point, Louise, the fruit of Grenache, as we mentioned, can be quite sweet tasting. Syrah is generally a much more savory variety. So when you add Syrahs, I know not in Australia, whoever's got the Australian examples, it can be very plush and very ripe, I know. But even in more restrained parts of Australia, like parts of Victoria, the Pyrenees, the Grampians, they can make a slightly more restrained style, Yarra Valley, Western Australia, places like that, but maybe not McLaren Vale and Barossa, I give you that. But in everywhere else in the world, Syrah makes a more savory style of wine compared to Grenache. So that means that to offset the sweetness and the ripeness and the occasional opulence of the fruit of Grenache, then you can have the more savory fruit profile of Syrah. And in addition, the tannin, a presence of tannin, is itself savory. I mean, it's drying, right? It's still tannin. So when you have the sweet Grenache fruit, the savory tannin of the Syrah can also help balance that out. And then another thing that may not be meaningful to you and me, but it's very important to winemakers, is color. Winemakers like to have wines with deeper color. They think that's what the public wants. And so Syrah, I think one of the most pigmented varieties, deeply pigmented, can add a lot of color to Grenache as well. So that's a useful thing. And finally, of course, as Lynn is making the point, acidity. We haven't really talked too much about acidity so far today. Hopefully you noted in your Grenache examples, there's not really a variety marked out by acidity. And neither is Syrah, but at least Syrah has got at least moderate acidity. I mean, it's not an Italian variety, it hasn't got high acidity, but it's at least moderate. So that will also contribute some freshness to what can otherwise be quite a sweet, cloying wine if it's just 100% Grenache. So Lynn is going to tell me what else I missed. Grenache is low in tannin, lower in acidity, and high in alcohol. So Syrah bumps up the tannin and the acidity, add color, and helps moderate the alcohol. Yep, the alcohol is a great point. Thank you, Lynn. Well, I missed that one. So yes, generally Grenache puts on alcohol very easily. The sugars ripen very quickly. And so Syrah will be a variety with more moderate levels of sugars and therefore reduced alcohol compared to Grenache. So there's at least 4, maybe 5 items there on that list that show you why Grenache and Syrah are so often blended together. We talked about, it's almost like fitting together the jigsaw pieces. Just the same as in Merlot and Cabernet, what one variety lacks, the other variety can offer. Very natural blending partners. In Priorat, they blend sometimes with some Carignan as well. And that can also add a bit of very savory quality, even tart, to, again, what can be quite sweet tasting fruit, and also can very importantly add acidity in a hot environment. Fleur is saying, in more general terms, Syrah brings definition to a wine. Yeah, I like that. I think both the acidity of Syrah and the more firm tannin structure brings what Fleur is calling definition, a bit of focus. We talked about the structureless structure, the diffuse tannins of Grenache. Fleur is arguing that the Syrah brings all those things into focus a bit more and gives a bit of a sense of definition and certainly a bit more sense of architectural shape to the wine. Alberto also adding aromatics. You can get some more aromatics from Syrah. Yeah, I agree with that. So we don't usually talk too much about flavors and aromas, but I agree, Alberto, that aromatics are important contribution from Syrah. And again, I would add more savory aromas and flavors from Syrah. Alberto is asking, what about Mourvèdre? Mourvèdre in a Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre blend, which you get in Australia, but you also get very frequently in Côte du Rhône and elsewhere in places like Vaccaras and other places in the Rhône Valley. So Mourvèdre is an even more savory variety than Syrah. The tannins are perhaps a little bit more rugged, more dry. So again, that will be a great counterbalance to the lack of tannin in Grenache and also the very sweet fruit of Grenache. And if you just want to make your wine in flavor profile a bit more savory and earthy, then that's also what Mourvèdre can do. So structure, savory quality, maybe some acidity. Essentially, Mourvèdre, I think, has got a lot of the same qualities as Syrah, but just all a bit more amplified. Lynn is saying, my Grenache has got just 10% Syrah and 10% Mourvèdre, and now I can really distinguish that presence. Yeah, good. I'm glad that you can, Lynn, because I think that in a blend of Syrah with Grenache, then if you're getting firm structure and savory qualities and acidity, that almost certainly doesn't come from the Grenache. So you know you must be in the presence of some other variety, most likely Syrah. Chengli, Syrah is prone to reduction, is also complemented by Grenache, which is prone to oxidation. Good point. So Chengli is making the point that Grenache is a variety which can oxidize very easily in the glass, in the bottle. If you guys have ever had a Chateauneuf du Pape or Côte du Rhône, and you've left half a bottle out overnight, often the next morning you'll find it a bit flat. I think one of the, I don't know the science well enough, but I would hazard that the slightly high pH, the soft quality of the Grenache wines, slightly high pH, certainly doesn't help preserve the freshness of the wine. Generally lower pH wines will preserve their freshness better. Think about if you open a German Riesling, it will just last forever when the bottle's open. That's because it's got such low pH. We're on the other end of the spectrum here. Even within the world of red wines, we're talking about a red wine with particularly high pH, making quite soft wines. pHs of 3.7, 3.8, or even higher. They can risk oxidation a bit more. So maybe that's why. I'm sure there are other reasons as well that the scientists know better than I do, but that would be one component, I'm sure. Okay, there's a lot to chew on there, not just the tannins, but any other questions, tell me now. Otherwise, we should move on to our final wine of the day, the Tempranillo. I do love to think though about this question about blending, because it's so important. It's such a thing that winemakers spend so much time thinking about, and we just kind of take it for granted. But there's such good reason behind doing it, and all so fascinating to kind of put the jigsaw together and work out why varieties are all blended together. And of course, it depends also on factors like vintage, winemaking style. We didn't really have much of a discussion, and we don't really have time to get into it now. But as you're telling me the flavors and aromas of your Tempranillo, please do that and tell me again which region you're in. As you guys are doing that, whole cluster in Pinot Noir or Syrah is when you don't remove the grapes from the bunch, and you just put the entire bunch in the fermentation vat. When you do that, you can get some more herbal, more spicy aromas, which they smell unusual and exotic. But given that Syrah can be quite a perfumed variety, just think about Côte Rôtie, or where else would be? I mean, most of the famous appellations in the Northern Rhone, just very brilliantly expressive of the violets and the smoky bacon, the black pepper, all those things. Those aromatics can be enhanced even further by the use of whole clusters of grapes in the Syrah fermentation vat. That's the same reason why people use them in Pinot as well. So it is a variety that you can mess around with quite a lot in the winery to get the style of wine that you want. Okay, so tell me about your Tempranillo. Louise has got a Ribera del Duero Crianza, 2015. Fresh figs, good note, black pepper, leather, blackcurrant, cardamom. So certainly some notes of ripeness and concentration in Louise's example of Ribera del Duero. 2015, certainly a nice vintage. Ribera del Duero, clearly a region where ripeness is not usually a problem. They do have other problems, such as early frost in the autumn. We often think about frost in the spring in wine regions in Europe, but because we're at sort of 2,000 feet of altitude, how much is that? It's about 600 meters in Ribera del Duero. You can often get some frosts even right around harvest, so that's something that they have to work with. But generally, other than that, can be very hot in the summer, 40 degrees C, things like that. So ripeness not usually a problem, and it sounds like Louise has got some good ripeness on her example. Lynn, meanwhile, is in Rioja, Marques de Riscal, Reserva, vanilla, cedar, leather, strawberry, clove, violet. Good, sounds like a classic example. Both combination, it sounds like to me, Lynn, of oak notes and also the variety. Alberto, Rioja Reserva 2009. Nice to have a slightly older example. Cherry, red plum, dill, leather, prunes. Some of you might not have heard the dill tasting note before. Dill, the herb dill, is often considered a tasting note for oak and new oak, and especially American oak dill. It sounds super weird until you smell it once, and then you you never forget it. Fleur, Rioja Alta Reserva 2010. Rioja Alta, quite a traditional oxidative style of winemaking. Strawberries, vanilla, leather, good. Okay, and then while we are just finishing that up, why don't you guys start thinking about tannin? How much tannin do you have in your examples? We've had two, I don't know, quite different, I guess, varieties in terms of the level of tannin, sort of low to moderate, or maybe just moderate in Grenache, whereas moderate to high, more like in Syrah. So where does the Tempranillo fit in for you? Shengli with a Muga Reserva, which is a lovely wine. That's a beautiful wine. Dried and tart red cherry. Black pepper, strawberry, and new oak. Good. Sounds delicious. Maria is saying that in her Ribera del Duero, she has got high levels of tannin. Louise in the same region has got moderate plus. So certainly we seem to be at the higher end of the spectrum, at least for Ribera del Duero. Alberto is saying moderate for Rioja Reserva. I mean, I guess if I'm not sure we've got the time to go into the Crianza Reserva, Gran Reserva, the scale of quality, but I guess that if you would have a Reserva or a Gran Reserva wine, you're working with riper, more concentrated grapes, potentially with thicker skins, and winemaking which is seeking to extract a bit more color, a bit more tannin, a bit more aroma, a bit more everything really, because these wines are intended for longer aging. So it would make sense that in the Rioja region, as you go up that scale of quality, then you would expect more tannins as well. Fleur is saying moderate. Lynn is saying medium tannin with some density, perhaps because of the 5 years of aging, softening them. Good. Fleur, let's just do the type of tannin. What's your best adjective? What's your best descriptor that you're going to go with for the texture or the sensation those tannins give on the palate? Fleur is saying smooth tannins and very well integrated with the fruit. Fleur is saying silky. So we've got smooth, we've got silky. So it sounds a bit familiar to me from the discussion of Syrah, which we just had. Lynn is saying chalky, on the other hand. I think that's a little bit different. Chalky for Lynn. And Louise is saying coarse, grainy, sticky. Okay, good. So again, quite different from the smooth or silky people. Louise is saying coarse, grainy, sticky. Very good. Excuse me. Maria is saying short-grained and polished. Lynn is saying, just making the comment, I think of chalky as like a thicker version of powdery. I'm with you. I'm totally with you, Lynn. I totally agree with you. So powdery would be at the absolutely possible finest grain. And then chalky would be a similar kind of sensation, but just a bit thicker all around. Yes, I agree, Lynn. Okay, then finally, where in your mouth, on your palate, do you feel these tannins most strongly? Is there one place that sticks out to you, or are we back in Grenache land where we just feel them everywhere? And what do you think? Tempranillo obviously is something of a blending variety because most Rioja is not 100% Tempranillo. Usually it's 90% with some Grenache, maybe with some Graziano, maybe some other local varieties. But in places like Ribera del Duero, it can often be 100%. In Toro, places like that. So to my mind, Tempranillo is much closer to being a single variety than Grenache is in many wines. More like a Syrah. Often you just get a Syrah. Tempranillo to me is a bit more like that than it is like a Grenache, where almost the default is that it would be blended. Lynn is saying that she feels the tannins on the cheeks and are forward on the tongue. Good. Maria is saying on the upper gums. Very good. Okay. Any final submissions about the location of the tannins? Do we agree with upper gums, or do we prefer cheeks and the front of the tongue? Okay, why don't I move my slide forward, see what I think. Shengli thinks the upper gums and the cheeks. So Shengli is having the best of both worlds. And Louise is saying the gums all around. Okay, good. So we've done Grenache, we've done Syrah. Here we go, Tempranillo. Moderate to high levels of tannin, I think very, very broadly speaking. Obviously, depending on the style of wine you're trying to make, but in Rioja, you're generally going to have slightly lower levels of tannin than you are in Ribera del Duero. In Rioja, except at Gran Reserva level, I'm thinking moderate, sort of moderate to high, whereas maybe in Gran Reserva you have high levels, but only really at that point in Rioja. In Ribera del Duero, on the other hand, then I think that high levels of tannin are almost the norm. I think so. Just a ripe region making powerful, concentrated, dense wines that really are quite a world apart from, say, traditional style Rioja, especially. Type of tannin. So I'm with the chalky people, I must admit. I do think there is a grain to these tannins. If you want to say powdery, yes, I've got no problem with that. For me, I just agree with Lynn, who is saying that chalky is just a bit thicker than powdery. And so if any of you had powdery tannins in the Syrah or even in the Grenache, then I think that these tannins in Tempranillo just tend to be a bit slightly coarser than powdery, but still with that same sort of powdery sensation, but just a bit coarser, a bit bigger, a bit thicker, as Lynn says. So I'm going to go with chalky. Chalky, remember, is literally like if you've ever, I always say this stupid example, which I think I'm going to date myself, but if you were in high school and you use that old, the chalk blackboard and the teacher wrote on there, and sometimes you'd have those chalk erasers and they'd just be stuffed full of chalk dust. And if you banged one, then this big plume of chalk dust would come up. And if you got any of that in your mouth, it would just dry out your mouth instantly with chalk dust. And that's what I think chalkiness, just the same sensation. That's just what it feels like. The other, and again, there's no science behind this, so don't let me persuade you that there is, but just bear in mind, or at least I bear in mind, the fact that both Ribera and large parts, but not all of Rioja, are on some form of limestone soils. And as I often say, limestone soils in red or white wines, Champagne, Burgundy, Barolo, Rioja, can give a chalky finish to a wine. Not always, but it can. And so when I taste chalkiness in Tempranillo, I'm not surprised when I think about the soil type. Again, scientists have got no science behind why this should be, but I do consistently find it in these limestone soils. And then finally, I do think that this is a wine of the cheeks. Again, this is an unusual location, which we haven't really had examples of before in these sessions. We've talked about the Syrah, which is an unusual location. But here, I know that with that, the nature of a chalky or a powdery sensation is that it seems to be everywhere. Yes, I agree with that. But here, I feel it especially in the cheeks. So to me, I always remember Tempranillo as being the chalk in the cheeks variety. And now in a sort of medium-bodied example of Rioja, which can be quite transparent wines, you do taste every flavor because the acidity is quite high as well. That seems to be logical and sensible and kind of unsurprising. But it's even more interesting, I think, to think about that in the context of Ribera del Duero. Sometimes I think Ribera del Duero can be a bit of an international style wine in the sense that it's got concentrated, dark, black fruits, powerful, full-bodied wine with high levels of tannin and outstanding aging potential. In that light, it can compete with other age-worthy wines, not just from Europe, but from many parts of the New World as well, which are placing more of an emphasis on fruit first. I think you get a lot of very fruit-driven wines in Ribera del Duero, often with quite a lot of new oak as well. So that's what I mean by international style. So in that international style, you sort of implicitly expect either the velvety rich tannins of the Syrah Shiraz style, or the high quality grainy style of Bordeaux tannins. But then you get something unexpected if you really listen to the wine, which is this chalkiness in the cheeks, and you kind of think, oh, that wasn't what I was expecting, and that's how you know you're in Tempranillo land. Alberto just making the comments that chalkiness is also a bit like dustiness, and I totally agree with that. We have had dusty textured wines before in this webinar course when we were talking about Sangiovese, where I mentioned the fact that Sangiovese can have a dusty quality to the fruit, but here I think the chalk dustiness belongs to the tannins. Where you feel that drying sensation is where you get that chalkiness. And Tempranillo is another example of a two textures wine. We just talked about the fact that Syrah, the tannins have got a very similar texture to what the fruit has got. They're both quite smooth, in a word. But in Tempranillo, you think about the quite rich, opulent fruit in a Ribera del Duero, or the fresh, even slightly tart fruit of a Rioja in the lower examples. And then the chalkiness is quite a different sensation from either. So this is another example of a wine like Merlot, for instance, where there's one texture for the fruit and another texture for the tannins. So a good example of a two texture variety. Now, I do want to just, someone emailed me this week and asked me to talk about the difference between, say, a Rioja and a Sangiovese from Tuscany, maybe like a Chianti. I think if you have a regular Chianti and you have a Rioja, Crianza or Reserva, it can be quite hard to tell them apart. So let's think about what separate those two just for a sec, because I think it can be quite instructive. I think, let's go from the top. The level of tannin can be quite similar if you're between Rioja and between Chianti, which would be moderate probably. Now the type of tannin is where it starts to get a bit more interesting. I do think there is a kind of graininess to both of them. If you remember what we said about Sangiovese, is that it's got a very sandy texture. It's certainly got a grain, but it's a sandy grained. If you remember, I was talking about how it was short grained. Here, there is a grain as well in the kind of in the powdery, chalky sensation of Tempranillo tannins, but the nature of the dustiness of that sensation is quite different from the hard sandiness of Sangiovese. That sandiness in Sangiovese is quite almost austere, maybe a little bit aggressive, but here the kind of sensation of swallowing a cloud of dust. Yes, you certainly feel it. Yes, it dries out your mouth, but it's not aggressive in the same way. And then finally, the location of the tannins, I believe, is very different. In keeping traditionally with Italian varieties, you feel the tannins on the gums in Sangiovese, and here, as just discussed, you have the very unusual location of the cheeks for Tempranillo tannins. So certainly, I think that the type and the location of tannins are quite different between the two regions. Shengley is saying, isn't there also a question of oak in there? Remember that while there is clearly oak is a very important facet of Rioja winemaking, it doesn't always have to be new oak. Certainly in Gran Reserva examples, yes. But in lower end examples, oak is quite expensive and you might not want to put Crianza wines in new oak. So Rioja doesn't mean new oak, traditional style Rioja doesn't always mean new oak, it just means oak of some kind. As you go up the quality ladder, more new oak, yeah, sure. So that could, so I think if you had a Gran Reserva, then you might have that distinction between the Sangiovese, the Italian wines, always unlikely to see, you know, new French, new American oak, and the Rioja, but at lower levels, not necessarily. Shengli is asking a question about soil types. No, I don't think it makes a difference. Shengli, for our purposes, the variety retains those sandy tannins and retains the same location of tannins on the gums. Okay, before we move on to the final kind of wrap-up slide, any further questions about Tempranillo? Does everything I say make sense to you guys? I hope I'm not just talking to myself, but I do think that Tempranillo is quite an interesting variety. I've confused Tempranillo with Syrah. If you think about it, it's not totally stupid. Both of them can have a very nice texture of fruit, but I think what separates them is the location of the tannins, the type of the tannins, and also the difference between the two-textured nature of Tempranillo and the single or mono-textured Syrah, where the tannins and the fruit share a similar texture. Okay, so here we go. So 3 very different structures. I think we can see in the Grenache, maybe not so much structure period, quite diffuse tannins that just seem to spread out, compared with the firm but very well textured tannins of Syrah, Shiraz, and then to this kind of chalky sensation given by the Tempranillo tannins felt in the gums, in the cheeks, excuse me. So 3 quite different styles, which is only worth making a point about, because if you contrast to, say, Bordeaux tannins, which are all felt in the same place, all got a similar kind of texture, or Italian ones, which are all grainy of some kind and all felt on the gums. We're in a different world here where you can draw quite clear distinctions between the different structures. I think all 3 definitely could be confused for other varieties, and that's why I think with these 3 varieties particularly, approaching them on the basis of tannin can be very useful. And then we had quite a nice discussion about blends. I think we counted at least 4 or 5 things that Grenache and Syrah can complement each other with. And this really goes to the heart of why winemakers are invested in blending wines, to bring out qualities that a single variety by itself might lack. Tell me any further questions if you have any, but that wraps up not only today's session, but also this entire course. I take this opportunity to say that, well, first of all, thank you for staying with me throughout the past 6 sessions. I hope you've enjoyed. I certainly have. If you are interested in continuing to taste in a similar way to this, but trying to kind of broaden our experience a little bit of tasting, I do have 2 new courses starting in November. One of them is going to be very interesting. It's about how to taste quality in wine, the factors that go into making differences in quality in wines, and how to taste those in the glass. So I think that's going to be a lot of fun. That starts, both of these in fact start in the 2nd week of November. And then I have another course where what we're going to do is, it's called A Taste of Europe, and we're going to take 4 different countries, 1 week for each country, and we're just going to dive into different regions and different varieties. So that's going to be much more of a chance to look at specific regions or specific varieties and say, what do these wines taste like and why, according to all the different factors of the climate and the winemaking styles and the traditions of the region and things like that. So if you'd like to join me for those, that would be my pleasure. But thank you for taking the time to speak with me. Thank you for sticking with me to the end, and I really appreciate your kind support. I'll see you on online again very soon. Thank you, guys.